British engineers opened captured Katyusha rocket launcher, found it made from scrap metal, yet terrified German armies, August 23, 1944. 1842 hours, western outskirts of Warsaw. The air still tasted of smoke, not from the guns that day, but from the city that would not die quietly. Major John Blackwood stepped down from the Bedford truck and felt the soft crumble of broken brick under his boots. Evening light stretched long over the fields, staining the wrecks and the hedgerows in tired gold. The wind carried a layered smell, burned timber from the direction of Warsaw, hot oil from idling engines, something sour from an abandoned German ration dump, and beneath it all, the iron scent of earth that had been turned over too many times by shells. He heard it before he saw it, the metallic rattle of loose rails against wood, swaying slightly in the breeze. Then his eyes found the truck. American-made Studebaker US-6, Soviet markings half-scraped, left nose down in a shallow ditch, as if the earth had tried to swallow it. On its back, the thing he had come for, 16 rails paired and parallel, angled up at 45 degrees, welded to a crude steel frame, bolted into the truck's bed. No elegant shield plates, no fine machining, just raw metal, seams of weld like rough scars. A weapon that looked as if it had been built in fury rather than in design. Katyusha. He had read the reports from the Eastern Front. Infantry companies erased in seconds. German panzer crews climbing out of their tanks and running because the sky itself seemed to fall apart when the rockets came. Men who had stood under 25-pounder fire without flinching, now shaking as they tried to describe the screaming sound, the way the ground leapt. Stalin's organ, they called it. Stalin Orgel. A joke hiding something close to fear. Up close it did not look like something to fear. Blackwood walked the length of the truck, gloved fingers tracing the edge of a rail. He felt spatter and slag under the leather. The welds would never have passed inspection at Woolwich or Enfield. The mounting brackets were cut unevenly, holes drilled off-center, shims hammered in where metal did not quite meet. He could see where someone had reused rail steel, likely torn from tracks the Germans had once marched over. "Looks like a scrap heap on wheels, sir," Lieutenant Davies murmured behind him. Blackwood did not answer. He was listening to the silence around it, to the absence of myth, to the distance between the terror in those German after-action reports and this ugly, improvised frame abandoned in a Polish ditch. He stepped up onto the rear step, leaned in to study the wiring, common truck batteries, simple leads, a firing switch that would not have been out of place in a village workshop. No delicate mechanisms, no complex sights, no arcane Soviet trick, just a way to throw many explosives very quickly into a square of earth where men were standing. He imagined for a moment the scene reversed. This truck not dead in the ditch, but alive on a ridge, rails loaded, crew hunched in Soviet uniforms. A command shouted, the slam of switches, the sudden tearing howl as 16 rockets leapt away at once, the light of their tails reflected in the eyes of German soldiers who had never seen such a storm before. The gap between how it looked and what it did disturbed him more than any heavy German gun, because this contraption said something dangerous. That terror did not need refinement. It only needed volume and speed. "Strip it," Blackwood said quietly. "I want to know exactly how this damn thing works." He climbed down as his men moved in with wrenches and notebooks, and the light faded over Warsaw. Somewhere far off, artillery muttered like distant thunder. Here, Beside the abandoned truck, another kind of storm was about to be taken apart, inch by inch. He had expected a miracle machine. What he was about to find instead was something far more unsettling. Where are you listening from tonight? Tell me what country or city you're in while hearing this story. Before the war, Major John Blackwood had been a man of numbers and quiet machines. He had spent 15 years at Vauxhall Iron Works designing valve systems for bus engines, not rockets. His hands were steady, his voice soft, and his imagination disciplined by geometry and steel tolerances. When the war began, he didn't rush to enlist. He was 41, already losing his hair, with a wife who liked roses and a daughter who still called the sound of rain the angels walking. It was only after Coventry burned in 1940 that he walked into a recruiting office and offered what he knew best: engines, stress tolerances, combustion. The Royal Engineers didn't need poets. They needed men who could make things work. By 1944, Blackwood had become part of a small technical liaison team. British officers attached to advancing Allied units tasked with studying captured German and Soviet technology. He had seen everything from wrecked Panthers to twisted V-2 fragments. War, he'd learned, was as much an industrial argument as a moral one. He thought he understood that argument. Precision wins. Quality endures. Engineering superiority will always overcome chaos. He believed that until the Eastern Front stories started coming in, stories that didn't fit his logic, reports of crude Soviet weapons that shouldn't have worked but somehow did, stories of factories that built tanks faster than Britain could build bicycles, and above all, the rumors of the weapon that turned battlefields into infernos, the one the Germans feared more than any artillery battery, the Katyusha. At first, he dismissed it as myth. No serious engineer could have designed something so barbaric, so indiscriminate. Rockets were for scientists, not soldiers. They were too unpredictable, too expensive, too inefficient. But the reports kept coming. Orsha, Stalingrad, Kursk, places where hundreds of German divisions had been shredded by barrages that lasted seconds. He saw intercepted Wehrmacht memos describing mass hysteria, panic in the ranks, loss of cohesion. That word, panic, disturbed him. War was supposed to be mechanical, predictable, kill ratios, range tables, shell weights, not panic. He tried to picture what kind of weapon could cause disciplined men to break. He imagined something vast, complex, maybe some secret chemical payload or acoustic trick. The kind of invention that would come from a laboratory, not a workshop. That illusion lasted until the day outside Warsaw, when he saw the truth up close. The thing on that Studebaker truck didn't belong in a laboratory. It belonged in a scrapyard. Yet it had changed the course of battles, terrified entire divisions, and rewritten how armies thought about firepower. That contradiction bothered him deeply because it struck at the foundation of everything he'd been taught. At night, back in the British field camp, he found himself staring at the flicker of the oil lamp, unable to sleep. He wrote in his field journal, "We have spent 5 years perfecting precision. The Soviets, it seems, have spent 5 years perfecting volume. We built instruments. They built storms." The next morning, when the order came to dismantle the captured launcher and prepare a full engineering report, Blackwood felt something stir inside him. Not excitement, not pride, but a strange, reluctant respect. He didn't yet know that what he was about to discover would make him question not only Soviet engineering, but the very definition of progress itself. He would learn that genius doesn't always wear the face of refinement. Sometimes it hides behind weld scars and recycled rails and wins wars anyway. September 2nd, 1944, a field west of Lublin, Poland. Dawn broke pale and colorless over the misted grass. The morning air smelled of damp soil and burned diesel. In the center of an open field, the captured Katyusha truck had been rebuilt and positioned on a shallow incline, its rails loaded with 16 live rockets recovered from abandoned Soviet depots. Major John Blackwood stood 50 yards behind it, collar turned up against the wind, a clipboard under his arm. Around him, a small Anglo-Polish detachment prepared for what would be the first Allied test firing of the weapon that had terrified German divisions from Smolensk to Stalingrad. "Batteries connected," he called out. Lieutenant Davis raised a hand. "Aye, sir. All 16 rails armed. Fuse line steady." Blackwood nodded once. He glanced toward the firing switch, a simple metal lever bolted to the side of the Studebaker's cabin, connected to a tangle of wires and copper clamps. It looked absurdly fragile, the kind of thing a farmer might cobble together in an afternoon. He felt a curious tension in the air, half skepticism, half dread. The men nearby spoke quietly in Polish, one of them crossing himself. Another spat into the dirt, muttering something about Stalin's devil. Blackwood lifted his watch. "Fire on my mark. 3, 2, 1. Davies threw the switch. What happened next was not sound. It was pressure. A roar tore through the field, low at first, then rising into a scream that split the sky. Fire burst from the rails, 16 tails of orange-white flame stabbing forward like lances. The earth shook. The air itself seemed to burn. The rockets screamed away in a rising arc, leaving trails of smoke that twisted like whips across the clouds. Their sound didn't fade. It climbed, a demonic chorus that rolled outward across the fields, echoing for miles. Then came the impact. The horizon erupted. One after another, 16 explosions flattened into a single rolling thunderclap. Dirt, fire, and debris shot upward in great orange plumes. Birds burst from the trees in every direction. A moment later, the shock wave reached them, a physical punch that hit the chest and the teeth. The sound went on forever. When it finally died, the world seemed too quiet. Blackwood lowered his hands from his ears. The mist that had covered the field was gone, blasted away. He stared at the distant tree line where the rockets had landed. A column of dark smoke climbed upward, expanding like a black flower. Davies broke the silence. "Christ almighty!" Blackwood didn't answer. He was still staring. His face had gone pale beneath the grime. He had watched countless artillery demonstrations, British 25-pounders, American 105s, even the massive German 88s. But this was something else entirely. It wasn't a weapon built to hit. It was a weapon built to consume. He realized, with a cold shiver, why the Germans feared it. It wasn't about destruction. It was about the seconds between the launch and the impact, when every man in its path would hear that rising scream and know there was nowhere to run. He walked closer to the truck, examining the empty rails still smoking faintly, the metal warped and blackened. "Primitive," he murmured, almost to himself, "but perfectly primitive." A Polish officer approached, his boots crunching over the churned ground. "So, Major," he asked in a heavy accent, "what do you think of Russian engineering now?" Blackwood's eyes stayed on the rails. "I think," he said slowly, "they've mastered something we've forgotten. Fear." He turned back toward his men. "Reload the launcher," he ordered. We'll fire again. This time, I want precise measurements." The second volley would confirm what the first had already told him. Katyusha was not a miracle of design, but a masterpiece of intent. It didn't aim for accuracy. It aimed for the mind. When the next rockets rose screaming into the dawn, Blackwood didn't flinch. He only whispered, "Now I understand." When the dust cleared, the only sound left was his heartbeat. By the afternoon of September the 2nd, the field near Lublin was unrecognizable. The once flat grassland had become a mosaic of scorched craters and churned soil. The team's measuring poles lay snapped or buried under black earth. Even at 2 miles from the target line, the air still carried the sour tang of burned propellant and pulverized clay. Major John Blackwood walked among the debris with the detached precision of an engineer, but inside he felt a strange unease, part awe, part shame. The blast pattern on his clipboard looked like chaos, yet every shattered tree and crater told a story of terrible efficiency. He noted the figures aloud to his adjutant, Davies. Impact dispersion, 300 meters at maximum range. Yield per rocket, 5 kilograms TNT equivalent. 16 rounds, roughly 80 kilograms of explosive in 10 seconds. Davies looked up from his notebook. "That's about the same as a full minute from 20 field guns, sir." Blackwood nodded. "Except these are mobile. They fire, move, and disappear before counter battery can answer. Even our best radar would only catch their smoke." He crouched beside one of the spent rails on the Studebaker, running a finger along the jagged weld seams. The metal was pitted and blackened, edges flaking like burnt bread. He could almost see the hands that made it, calloused, hurried, untrained, but guided by something larger than skill, necessity. "They built this from whatever they had," he said softly. "Rail scrap, plumbing pipes, old steel, and yet it works." Davies frowned. "You mean by luck?" "No, by intent. They accepted imperfection as part of the design. That's the difference." He straightened and gestured at the launcher. "Look here. These rails aren't straight. They're bent a few millimeters each. In our factories, that would be rejected. But these men built weapons in cities under siege. The tolerances didn't matter because the purpose wasn't precision. It was volume. Every rocket misses, but together they don't." He paused. "It's engineering stripped of vanity." That night, as the team packed up, Blackwood sat alone in the truck's cabin, his field notes open under the weak glow of a lantern. Rain tapped against the glass, mingling with the distant thud of artillery from somewhere east of the Vistula. He began writing his report, the words forming faster than he could think. "This device is a study in brutal efficiency. Its power does not come from accuracy or sophistication, but from multiplication. 16 rockets, each crude, collectively overwhelming. A single Katyusha is nothing. A regiment of them is apocalypse." He underlined the last word, then leaned back and exhaled slowly. Outside, the Polish soldiers were singing quietly, old resistance songs, carried soft on the wind. He listened for a moment, then closed his notebook. War, he thought, was not a contest of craftsmanship. It was arithmetic. Steel, fuel, time. Who could turn chaos into fire faster? The next week, his superiors received his full dossier, 47 pages of analysis and sketches. He expected a polite acknowledgment, maybe a note of interest from Whitehall. Instead, the report was circulated through the Allied technical mission within days. Engineers in London, Washington, and Ottawa read it in silence. The British were stunned by its simplicity. The Americans were impressed by its cost-effectiveness, and the Germans, if they ever saw it, would have recognized the echo of their own dread. One Soviet officer, interviewed months later, would summarize it perfectly. The British built masterpieces, we built monsters, and monsters win wars. For Major Blackwood, the test changed everything. He no longer saw war as a duel of precision, but as a storm of improvisation, of men and metal pushed beyond reason. He wrote in his private journal, "Our science made the world logical. Theirs made it survivable. We perfect, they persist, and persistence, I suspect, is the stronger force." By the time he closed the book, he knew the Katyusha wasn't just a weapon. It was a philosophy born not from wealth, but from desperation, where every weld, every scratch, every scream of the rockets said the same thing: we will not lose because we cannot afford to. London, November 12, 1944. A cold rain drummed against the iron-framed windows of the War Office. The air smelled faintly of dust, ink, and the wet wool of uniforms. Major John Blackwood stood at the far end of the briefing room, facing a semicircle of senior officers, men whose medals clinked softly when they shifted in their chairs. On the table before him lay a stack of sketches, photographs, and fragments of Soviet steel, the remains of a Katyusha launcher. Colonel Whitmore, head of Allied Ordnance Evaluation, tapped a pencil against his notepad. "Let's be clear, Major," he said. "You're suggesting that this Soviet contraption, this mess of rails and truck parts, is the most effective field artillery design of the war?" Blackwood's voice was calm. "Not the most precise, sir. The most adaptable." Whitmore arched an eyebrow. "Adaptable? It looks like it was welded together by a drunk blacksmith." Blackwood didn't flinch. He stepped forward and held up a photograph, a blurred image of 16 white streaks tearing across a smoky sky. "This," he said, "was taken near Lublin during a controlled firing. 16 rockets, 10 seconds. The resulting barrage leveled a 3-acre area. No other system can deliver that saturation so quickly." One of the American liaisons, Colonel Harding, leaned back in his chair. "We've got Calliopes on our Shermans. Same principle, right? Rockets on rails. But our men don't fear our rockets." Blackwood turned toward him. "Because you haven't faced them coming at you, Colonel. Ask the Germans who held the line at Kursk. Ask the men who heard that scream before the sky fell." The room went quiet. Rain hammered harder against the glass. Whitmore cleared his throat. "Still, you're talking about something built from scrap. Hardly a model for civilized warfare." "Perhaps that's why it works," Blackwood said evenly. "Civilized warfare died in 1939. The Soviets understood that first." He set down his folder and began pacing slowly. His tone changed. Lower now, thoughtful, almost haunted. "Gentlemen, the Katyusha isn't brilliant engineering, it's brutal logic. It exists because the Soviets couldn't afford precision. They needed volume, they needed fear, and they built both." He stopped, looking each man in the eye. "We build machines to last. They build machines to win now." There was a long silence. The only sound was the clock ticking on the wall. Finally, Harding spoke again, voice softer. "You admire them, don't you?" Blackwood hesitated. The question hung in the air like smoke. "I respect what they achieved," he said. "They built victory out of scrap metal. That's not something to admire. It's something to fear." He lifted one of the bent steel rails from the table, holding it up so the officers could see the rough welds. "This rail," he said, "was once part of a railway track. It probably carried food, refugees, maybe even soldiers. Someone cut it, welded it, and turned it into a weapon that made entire divisions flee. That's not just engineering. That's transformation." Whitmore frowned. "Transformation?" "Yes, sir. Of desperation into design, of poverty into power. The Germans called it barbaric. I call it inevitable." He laid the rail down with a dull clang. "If we fight another war like this one, gentlemen, the side that wins won't be the one with the finest machinery. It will be the side that can turn the simplest machinery into the most terrible thing imaginable." The room fell into heavy silence again. A few of the younger officers shifted uneasily. At last, Whitmore rose. "Your conclusions will be forwarded to the Ministry of Supply," he said. "But I'll be honest, Major. We prefer to think progress means refinement." Blackwood gave a weary smile. "Progress isn't refinement, sir. It's survival." He gathered his papers, saluted, and walked out into the rain. Outside, the city's blackout lamps glowed faintly through the mist. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the muted rumble of Allied bombers returning from the continent. He paused on the steps, feeling the chill seep through his gloves. He realized then that his admiration for the weapon wasn't about its design. It was about its message, that in war, elegance dies first, and only the crude, the desperate, the relentless endure. He turned his collar up against the wind and disappeared into the London fog, his mind echoing with the same sound he had heard on that Polish field, the shriek of rockets tearing through the dawn, and for the first time he understood why even the bravest men broke when they heard it. May 1945. Berlin had fallen. The guns were silent at last, but silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like the moment after an explosion when your ears are still ringing and your body doesn't know the war is over. Major John Blackwood stood in a deserted rail yard outside Potsdam, surrounded by wreckage that once defined an empire, rusted locomotives, shattered freight cars, and the twisted remnants of artillery barrels lay scattered like the bones of some great mechanical beast. He had come with an Allied inspection team to examine captured Soviet equipment abandoned in the city's final chaos. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same British officer who'd spent months analyzing a Katyusha in Poland was now walking through piles of their wrecked brothers. The air was thick with the smell of oil and rain. He stopped beside a destroyed launcher, its rails bent upward like the ribs of a carcass, the Studebaker's engine block split open by shrapnel. He ran his hand over the scarred metal, the soot still smearing his fingertips. It was strange how human it looked up close. Not elegant, not engineered, just endured. Davies, who had remained his aide since Poland, approached quietly. "Funny, isn't it, sir? All this destruction, and yet it worked?" Blackwood nodded. "It did. Better than anyone expected, including them." He looked up at the gray sky. The world was rebuilding already, but in that moment it felt as if the war had left its fingerprints on everything, on the land, on the people, even on the steel. He crouched beside the launcher and whispered more to himself than to Davies. "All these years we thought victory came from precision, but in the end it came from persistence." He picked up a small fragment of twisted metal, part of a rocket tail, the faint Cyrillic letters still visible through the soot. It was light in his hand, almost fragile. Yet this little piece had once been part of something that could erase a field of men in seconds. "How do you make peace?" he said quietly, "with something so simple that causes so much fear?" Davis didn't answer. The question wasn't meant to be answered. Blackwood placed the fragment gently back on the ground. "It's strange," he murmured. "We spent years perfecting how to kill, and in the end, the crudest thing was the most perfect of all." As the wind swept through the yard, it rattled the hollow rails, producing a faint, eerie hum, like a ghostly echo of the rocket's song. Blackwood closed his eyes. For a moment, he could almost hear the scream again, the one that had haunted him since that morning in Lublin. He thought of the men who had fired it, young, exhausted, nameless, and of the men who had died beneath it, equally young, equally nameless. The machine didn't care who they were. It never did. When he opened his eyes again, the rain had begun to fall harder, streaking down the metal like tears. He took a final look at the launcher and turned away. Some wars end with treaties, others end with exhaustion. But the one he had witnessed, the War of Engineers, would never really end. It would just evolve. He knew that somewhere, even now, someone was already designing the next version, cleaner, faster, deadlier. And he knew, too, that it would begin with the same logic the Soviets had taught him. You don't need perfection. You just need enough. He left the yard in silence, boots echoing softly on the wet concrete, carrying nothing with him but that truth, and the sound of distant thunder that would never really fade. England, 1959. 15 years had passed since Major John Blackwood last saw a battlefield. His uniform now hung in a cedar chest, the medals dulled by time. The war had faded into history books and parades, but for him it still lived in sound. The low thunder of engines, the hiss of ignition, the scream of rockets that once tore the dawn apart. He was 56 now, a lecturer at the Royal Military College of Science in Shrivenham. Most days he taught young officers the theory of ordnance, muzzle velocities, fuse timings, the mathematics of destruction. They admired him, though few knew that the calm man before them had once dismantled Stalin's deadliest storm weapon by hand. But some nights, when the corridors emptied and the rain began to fall, he would stay behind in the lab, tracing his fingers over a rusted steel fragment locked inside a glass case. It was the same Katyusha rail he'd carried out of that Polish field years ago, a relic of crude genius that had haunted him ever since. He often wondered what the young men in his lectures would think if they knew the truth, that the future of warfare didn't belong to precision or perfection, but to the brutal simplicity of what he held in that case. In 1957, when the Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, Blackwood had stared at the newspaper photograph for a long time, not because of the achievement itself, but because he recognized the shape of the booster underneath. A rocket, long and slender, born from the same bloodline as the Katyusha. He had smiled bitterly. The world's first step into space had begun with a weapon of fear. The next year, he received an invitation from an American colleague to witness a demonstration of their new multiple-launch rocket system prototype, inspired, they admitted privately, by Soviet designs. The same principle, many rockets, fired fast, cheap, mobile, overwhelming. When the first volley went off, the air filled with that same shriek, higher pitched now, cleaner, but unmistakable. One of the American officers had laughed. "Hell of a sound, isn't it, Major? You can almost feel the history in it." Blackwood hadn't laughed. He had simply nodded, eyes on the smoke. "Yes, I've heard it before." He understood then that the war's lesson had taken root everywhere. The Soviets had kept evolving the Katyusha, BM-21 Grad, BM-27 Uragan, BM-30 Smerch. The Americans had built their Calliopes, their MLRS, their HIMARS. The principle was eternal. More rockets, more fire, more fear. Even peace had borrowed the same logic. Factories learned mass production from wartime necessity. Economies grew from the same efficiency that once built weapons. Humanity, it seemed, had adopted the Katyusha's creed without realizing it. The triumph of the good enough. One evening, after a lecture, a young officer stayed behind. "Sir," he asked, "if you had to choose precision or power, which wins a war?" Blackwood looked out the window at the darkening sky over Oxfordshire, where rain glistened on the glass like old shrapnel scars. "Neither," he said. "What wins is endurance, the will to make do with what you have and never stop." The young man looked puzzled. "That sounds more like philosophy than engineering, sir." Blackwood smiled faintly. "That's what I thought once, too." He watched the student leave, then turned back to the fragment in its case. The steel had rusted to a deep brown, but the welds were still visible, uneven, human, honest. History would forget the names of the men who built it, but their work would echo through every rocket fired since, through every storm of steel that followed. He leaned closer to the glass and whispered, "You changed the world, didn't you?" Outside, thunder rolled over the English hills, a long, distant rumble that sounded almost like the scream of rockets fading into time. He closed his eyes. "Wars don't end," he thought. "They just wait for another generation to remember them." This was one man's story among millions. A quiet engineer who began the war believing in precision and ended it believing in survival. He didn't fire a weapon. He didn't storm a trench. But he understood, perhaps more than any soldier, how fear could be manufactured, welded together out of scrap, steel, and desperation. The Katyusha was never beautiful. It was never elegant. But it worked, not because it was perfect, but because it never needed to be. That was its genius and its curse. Even now, every modern rocket battery, every thunder of massed fire that rolls across a battlefield carries its echo. You can still hear it in the shriek of launchers in distant wars. You can still see it in the black smoke that climbs into the morning sky. The ghost of the Katyusha never left us. It simply changed uniforms. Major John Blackwood died in 1967, quietly, at home. On his desk, his daughter later found a small note written in his thin, precise handwriting. "The future belongs to those who can turn ruin into force. The danger is we never learned how to stop." If you're hearing this somewhere safe, perhaps on your commute, perhaps at home, perhaps half a world away, remember that behind every great invention lies a choice, to build for progress or to build for survival. The Katyusha taught humanity how thin that line truly is. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Tell me your city, and tell me, do you believe humanity has learned from the sound of its own thunder